Welcome to CN Live's continuing coverage of Julian Assange's extradition hearing at the Old Bailey in London. This is Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News for CN Live. Day 16, a really big day at the court. Just when we thought we were going over the same material over and over again about conditions at the ADX Florence facility in Colorado and SAMS, and we'll get to that later, we had an inkling of something dramatic to come just as we were breaking for lunch. And that's when defense attorney Mark Summers informed the court that he wanted to put forward two anonymous witnesses for the defense. And that's how it ended. And Vanessa Barreza, the judge, said she'd come back and discuss that after lunch. So, of course, we were trying to figure out who that might be, and we were totally wrong in the guesses that we were taking. We actually didn't hear what this was about until the very end of the court's day. And I won't skip over the testimony before that, but I do want to get to this because it's the biggest news of the day. Excuse me, the anonymous witnesses are two employees of UC Global, the Spanish security firm that was hired by the Ecuadorian government to provide video surveillance of the embassy in London. And that, of course, is where Julian Assange lived, excuse me, for 7 years until the 19th of, I think it was the 19th or the 9th of April, 2019, when he was arrested. We learned subsequently that UC Global's founder and director, Mr. David Morales, had in fact had contacts with what he calls American friends. And we know from a lot of reporting, such by Max Blumenthal, that those American friends were connected with the Las Vegas Sands Hotel, the casino owned by Sheldon Adelson. And there was a allegation that we read about in the press from one of the witnesses in the trial. Now, what's going on in Spain is that Morales has been arrested for illegal surveillance of Assange. And what we heard through reporting and court documents from that case was that UC Global had a relationship. This hasn't been proven yet, but that the allegation by the witnesses who work with Morales at UC Global is that he had his American friends, and that he came back and said he came back from one of his trips to the US and told them they're in the first division now in the big league, that those American friends are the Central Intelligence Agency, and that what had happened was that the video system that UC Global set up had no audio. They put audio in and they fixed it so that there was a direct feed back to the US. This is what the witnesses said, so that the Central Intelligence Agency, the government that is prosecuting Julian Assange right now in this extradition hearing, were able to listen in 24/7 and watch Assange, including his confidential discussions with his lawyers in preparing for this very hearing. They knew it was going to come someday. So all of his defense preparations were listened into by the government. That normally would be a motion from the defense to dismiss a case. That there was absolutely, you cannot have the prosecuting government listening in on the person they're prosecuting, his discussions with his lawyers. Also, his doctor's visits were listened into, and presumably all of his social and personal meetings as well. They just had a 24/7 surveillance. This, again, are the allegations of some employees of UC Global, and who the witnesses are that Mark Summers and the defense want are indeed two witnesses from UC Global. They have requested protection. They want anonymity. They fear for their lives from David Morales. That was clearly discussed in the court today. Morales' home was raided by Spanish police, and they found loaded firearms with their serial numbers filed off. He is under provisional release. Those men are under armed guard at time, these two witnesses. They could be men, they could be women, by the way. Summers doesn't himself know that, he pointed out. They're under fear of retaliation and repercussions from Morales if they testify, and they already have some of them in the Spanish court, but if their testimony is also read out here in the British court, where the United States government is trying to get Assange extradited, and therefore the US government is going to sit in the room there and listen to this testimony. It's been decided by the judge Baird that she would grant anonymity to these two witnesses. It's highly unusual. but she did so because the Spanish court had already decided. That's what she based her founding on. She asked lots of questions like, wouldn't Morales know who these guys are, or these two witnesses, I should say, because one of them has been identified as having once owned 50% of UC Global and then sold it back to Morales. So the other one would be known to him as well. But Summers made an interesting point. Right now, only Morales knows who they are. If we reveal their name here in the British court, others would know as well, perhaps widening the danger. And the implication there was danger from the American state. I even think Baird made a statement of that point. Would he be under danger from the United States? It's an extraordinarily powerful moment in this proceeding. We hoped and waited for this moment when the UC Global case would be introduced. There's been a lot of discussion because the case is still going on that it may not be able to be brought into evidence here in London, in the case in London. But in fact, it will be under this rubric here of anonymity for both witnesses. It seems like on Thursday, their evidence will be read, although Summers, in his argument to grant anonymity, actually spoke a little bit about he leaked out a little bit of the evidence, and that was that there was a plot that Morales talked about with his American friends to poison Julian Assange or to kidnap him. This is part of what the evidence was that came out in the Spanish court and presumably will come out in the British court. It seems to be on Thursday. Now, earlier in the proceedings that I'll get to about conditions at the facilities in Alexandria and in Colorado, where Assange most likely will go if he's extradited, Edward Fitzgerald, the defense attorney, the QC, he slipped in there when they were discussing who makes the decision to put a prisoner under the special administrative measures. Those are solitary confinement with an extra layer of measures that prevent a inmate from communicating with anyone, basically anyone, certainly no other prisoners, but only maybe 1 or 2 calls a month amounting to 30 minutes with an approved family member, and mail that can be delivered, but sometimes months after. So this is what we were waiting for. And Julian Assange was standing in the back of the court looking quite confident here, because we know that some incredible evidence will come out about the CIA. And it was then in that moment in the previous testimony when Fitzgerald was speaking about who makes the decision to put someone under special administrative measures. And that was when he slipped in there that it would be the Attorney General, of course, who makes this decision, but in consultation with intelligence agencies in a case of national security where classified information is involved. Most of the prisoners, it seems, under SAMS are terrorism convicted terrorists, basically, and the government is afraid they will be able to send out coded messages or to their lieutenants to operate another terrorist attack. So that's why they're kept in such incredible incommunicado. But when Assange's case will be national security information, in other words, he possesses in his mind, certainly he would not have it on his possession if he goes to jail in the US, but they don't want him to leak any more classified information. That's the government's argument anyway. And Fitzgerald asked one of the witnesses, would the CIA be consulted? And she said yes. At that point, I didn't understand, because I was thinking of Vault 7, which he's not being charged with. But now we understand why he mentioned the CIA, because the CIA will come up in testimony on Thursday as having possibly plotted to kill Julian Assange. Let me say that again. The CIA will come up in testimony on Thursday of having possibly plotted to kidnap and or poison Julian Assange. That is something beyond dramatic. And it came to Lewis, James Lewis QC, the British lawyer for the United States government. It fell upon him first to say he was neutral about whether to grant anonymity, but then he made a pretty extraordinary statement, and this is an extraordinary circumstance in the courtroom. Having anonymous witnesses in itself is unusual, but he said that he would not be able, the Justice Department in the US, from which he's getting his instructions, would not be able to tell him whether or not to even challenge this testimony, this written testimony that we're going to hear on Thursday. Why? Because he spoke of a Chinese wall that is constructed between the Department of Justice and other agencies of government, like the Central Intelligence Agency. So yes, that is the way the US system operates, at least on paper. The idea that the executive branch can interfere with the Department of Justice. We've heard this in testimony throughout these now almost 4 weeks, that Trump ordered the arrest of Assange, as Cassandra Fairbanks testified. And we had other expert witnesses saying that Bill Barr is a believer, the Attorney General, who would decide the SAMs, by the way, that if this happens under, if there's another Trump administration, that Bill Barr is a believer in the unitary executive, meaning that the president should decide who gets prosecuted. These are king-like powers. We discussed this on an earlier report. So therefore, there's supposed to be this wall, but as I'm saying here, it doesn't really exist all the time. It should exist, and maybe it does most of the time, but there are too many examples where the executive branch can interfere in the judicial branch, and in this case, yes, in the Department of Justice. So he said he wouldn't be able to even determine whether he's going to be able to challenge this testimony. I'm getting handed notes by my producer, which I'm ignoring for the moment because it's breaking my train of thought. But I want to just say that that was an extraordinary moment there when Lewis said that he won't be able to get an instruction from the Department of Justice. So we're going to hear on Thursday this testimony from two witnesses, written. They won't appear on video. They won't be certainly in the courtroom. They're still involved in the Spanish case, which is ongoing against David Morales. But we can presume, based on what we've known in the press reports and what Summers said today in the discussion over whether they grant anonymity or not, that the U.S. friends of Morales and their attempts on Assange's life will become spoken about. Okay. Arrested on April 12th, I'm corrected, on 2019. Yes, the United States has been given 24 hours now and they will be told the identity of these two witnesses, the U.S. defense team, and they will check back in the U.S. to see if these guys, these two witnesses have ever been convicted of a crime in the U.S. or if there's anything, as Lewis said, that the court should know about them. So we'll presume that they don't have a record. Even if they do, I don't think necessarily that would prevent them from giving testimony. But we have to wait and see about that. But that's why we have like a 24-hour waiting period right now, because the U.S. needs to vet these guys and basically approve them. To approve them, the U.S. is going to vet them, and therefore it will come forward on Thursday. So let's go back to what happened earlier in the day, when we had two witnesses. The first was Maureen Baird, and Maureen Baird was the warden at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan. You might know of that place because that's where Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. At least officially, that's what he did. She was the warden there, not when Epstein was killed, though his name did come up in court because the prosecution was trying to argue that it has a great record. There's not a lot of suicides. There hadn't been one there, I think she said, in 17 years. And therefore, this woman, Baird, the former warden, spoke about SAMs, the Special Administrative Measures, because there were up to 15, I think, prisoners in the Metropolitan Correction Center that were under the Special Administrative Measures. And she said that this was created, by the way, after the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s. But after 9/11, everything changed. We've heard that before. And one of the things that changed was this explosion of special administrative measures, because a lot of so-called terrorism suspects were being held pre-trial at the MCC. So she's familiar with what that means. And what that means is you are locked away, and she even said could be up to 24 hours a day. They might let you out 15 minutes. 1 or 2 days maximum. So you go to a room, you self-recreate. That's the word that our friend Gordon Kromberg says in his affidavit. That's what happens. You self-recreate. Someone asked, I think it was yesterday, what does that mean? Well, you get to walk around a room by yourself. And in fact, she said there was no exercise equipment in the one at the MCC, and she put in an exercise bike. So someone in solitary can go out and go on 15 minutes on a bike, or maybe an hour, You could only get one call a week, a month rather, one 30-minute call or two 50-minute calls. You couldn't get mail. You cannot speak to anybody else. Yesterday, we had a witness talking about the SAMs at the ADC, and you have to scream through a steel door or talk through the food slit. Now, what's important here is that the special administrative measures are a directive from the Attorney General. So there's no way to contest that, Baird said. It's not like the local prison, wherever there's a SAMS, and there aren't many places apparently, they can't make their decisions about what changes can be made or modifications. It has to be what the Attorney General, what the Federal the Bureau of Prisons, the BOP, determine them to be, so that when Claire Dobbin, the prosecutor, tried to undermine both witnesses, first Maureen Baird and later lawyer Lindsay Lewis, that they hadn't visited the ADC, the Alexandria Detention Center. They haven't visited the ADX in Colorado. So how could you possibly testify? You can't help the court, can you? She's saying. Well, in fact, what Baird was saying is that this uniform, wherever there are SAMs, it's the same exact rules, and they cannot be modified by the local court. Now, that issue of modification came up because there was a court case about 7 or 8 years ago called Cunningham versus Bureau of Prisons, I believe, and that was someone who sued about the conditions in Colorado, ADX, this very prison, and there was a settlement in the case after, I think, 4 years of litigation, and the settlement moved about 100 or so prisoners out of the ADX and improved some of their conditions there. But this became a real point of argument and contention. Did that apply to all the prisoners, including the ones in SAM, or only prisoners who were not under solitary confinement with special administrative measures? And I don't think that was actually resolved right now, because Dobbin kept referring to a report by a government report, and both Baird and Lewis said that this woman who wrote this report for the U.S. government didn't know what she was talking about, that she'd obviously never seen the ADC or any SAMS facility whatsoever. And this is the same with Kromberg. He's been challenged over and over again as having not knowing what he's talking about. In fact, he's asserted there is no solitary confinement at the Alexandria Detention Center. We heard yesterday from Yancey Ellis, a lawyer who's been many, many times to the solitary confinement at the Alexandria Detention Center. So that what we have here, again, is the U.S. government trying to say, look, it's not that bad in the U.S. prisons. He's not going to really be treated all that badly, right? Yes, he can't go out for 23 hours a day. Yes, he could only get one phone call. I mean, it's just quite extraordinary to hear them trying to defend, which is a system that does not exist in Great Britain. And that's a key point here, that in Britain, and we go to Lindsay Lewis now, her Abu Mazza was, or Khaled Abu Mazza al-Masri was the Finsbury Park Mosque preacher who was arrested and eventually was extradited to the US. Lindsay Lewis was his attorney in fighting that extradition, and he had apparently been and was convicted later in the US of terrorist offenses inside Yemen. But his conditions now under ADX are extraordinary. The man has lost both his arms, and she described how he has no mental health care there, no special measures really. He has to open up tin cans of food with his teeth, which lead to infections in his teeth, and he's not getting dental care for that. So it was horrific to hear. Now, this guy was a convicted terrorist, but he's a prisoner, and he's got life, and he's inside this facility. But the key point about the Lindsay Lewis testimony was on direct examination by Fitzgerald, in which he pointed out that Lewis, the attorney, but the suspect at that time, or the person on remand, Abu Mazza, was in fact told by the U.S. court, by the U.S. government in this extradition hearing, that he would not go to SAMS or solitary confinement, and if he did, it would only be a short time. And in fact, he was sent there, and 10 years later, he's still there. 8 years later, he's still there. So don't trust the U.S. government is the message the defense was trying to put out with this witness. Don't trust what the U.S. government's telling you, Judge Baird, that Assange won't be treated badly, that we don't know whether he's going to get special administration measures or solitary confinement or not. This is the point they keep saying. We don't know what the intention of the government is, but even if they intend to throw the book at him and give him the worst treatment possible, they're holding out here in the court that you don't know, you're only speculating. Well, Maureen Baird came back with that and said, well, from my experience, and she's been a case manager in determining where prisoners are housed, which prison they'll be going to. She's been involved in that with the Justice Department, and she was a manager of that. And she said the government typically never mentions special administrative measures unless they intend to use them. They will just, if it's on the table, in her experience, they're going to be used. So this became really contentious with Dobbin, who was very slow in developing her case, and it's very hard to listen to the way she tries to really condescendingly, I have to say, and I think I'm being objective, condescendingly undermine the confidence of the witnesses and attack their reputations or certainly their qualifications. That's what we saw for the entire day until the anonymous witnesses were discussed at the end of the court. And those are the UC Global employees who are going to testify in the British court, as they have in the Spanish court, about what role Morales played in the surveillance of Julian Assange with a link, direct audio and visual 24/7 real stream back to the CIA. That's what they testified. Apparently, that's what's been reported. Anyway, we're going to hear it now when the court opens on Thursday. We should hear that testimony read in court, and we will see what the CIA role may have been in even trying to plot an assassination of Julian Assange. If that doesn't shake that courtroom, I don't know what will. That concludes my report for tonight, day 16. Once again, patreon.com/CN Live to keep these reports going. And we're looking forward to speaking to you again tomorrow. And we're particularly looking forward to day 18, which is Thursday, when we should hear this explosive testimony about the Central Intelligence Agency, their surveillance of Assange by the very government that's prosecuting him right now to get him extradited. Their government spied on his confidential conversations and protected conversations with his attorneys. So until tomorrow, when we have some more testimony, this is Joe Lauria for CN Live.